The Groman Grub was your usual Toyran catering establishment. It accepted customers from all regions of the common space and accommodated for all. The four-legged, the six-legged, and even the five-armed. Any citizen could stroll in at any time of the local cycle and expect to be treated in a manner that suited them by both the staff and their fellow customers. In fact, the Grub was soon becoming famous for its remarkably clean history, which is why the events of the 27th December 2231 are such a shame to recall. It seemed that to be scorned for one's base appearance was a curse placed upon only one species, humanity. It was for this reason that, on this fateful day, the entire dining hall of the Grub fell absolutely silent when Jason and Alexis stepped over the threshold. Jason took the lead. He smiled at the Toyran waiter behind the counter, who flinched and moved over to a table in the far corner of the room. He made a show of offering the first chair to Alexis, gesturing towards the seat grandly with his arms. She didn't react. She just sat down and looked around the room until he followed. Then she leaned over. "This isn't right, Jason," she murmured as a much more reserved, ambient noise returned to the dining hall. "I'm sure every single citizen in here is reacting to us." "I expect they are," he replied. "Why do you say that?" she demanded. "And why the hell did you smile at that waiter?" Jason grinned, flashing those pearly white canines at her, those very same teeth that had likely caused the poor waiter to defecate where he stood. She knew that the vast majority of citizens went their entire lives without encountering a member of the carnivorous species, with most only hearing of them from long-distance sailors who were far too fond of their drink. Indeed, the emergence of such species only a few centuries before had shattered established a major scientific understanding within the common space. Only cultures of prey could survive long enough to reach even their neighboring planets. Humanity was one of the few species to break this rule, and being human, they had done it in the most spectacular fashion they could manage. Because we're humans, Alex. We're over 5,000 light years away from the nearest Edom system. They should never have even heard of us. Jason didn't say anything. He just leaned back and motioned towards the screen embedded in the wall just behind her. She sighed and turned, looking, over the heads of the Valerie family that were clearly scrambling to finish their meal as quickly as possible, towards the screen. A particularly nonpartisan newsreel was sporting the headline, "The Carnivore Empire crushes yet another peaceful system. Total subjugated worlds reaching breaking point. No action from the council." "That's hardly fair. We're omnivores," she protested, turning around. As she did, she caught the eye of a Toyran waitress. The citizen seemed to shrink where she stood, but she bolstered the courage to head over anyway. "Good noon after," she said, adopting English as best she could. "What would want eat?" Jason looked ready to smile again, so Alexis shot him a glare and looked up at the Toyran. The poor girl's large ears were subconsciously rippling as they attempted to cool her down, her heart rate undoubtedly rising. "I haven't been here in about 20 cycles. Do you still serve the pulgar salad?" she asked as politely as she could. The waitress seemed taken aback. Yes. "I would like that then, please, as would my accomplice." "Would you want what to drink?" "Waters for both of us, please." The waitress bowed and was about to leave when Jason spoke up. "What is your name?" he asked. "It is Hora," she replied. Alexis watched the exchange, ready to jump in and save the poor girl. "You speak English very well. My name is Jason." "Thank you, Mr. Jason." "Not at all," he said, and smiled. "Asshole." Alexis quickly jumped into the rescue as the girl's face lost all of its remaining color. "Forgive him, please, Hora. He has never been this far from home. For our people, a smile is a friendly gesture," she said perhaps too quickly. Hora merely nodded and scurried back to the counter where what must have been her boss was waiting. Alexis turned a withering stare upon Jason, who at least had the grace to look guilty. Twice in less than 5 minutes. I didn't mean. You have to be so much more careful. Why? They're terrified. You know what happens when someone thinks they've been backed into a corner. I know what happens when a person is backed into a corner, not a bloody tauren. Tauren, she sighed. They're not all that small out here, Jason. The arrival of the waitress with their drinks and food quieted the discussion for a moment, and the humans began to eat. Alexis caught the occasional glance of a sideways-facing eye towards their table, but there was no further interaction from any other customers while the meal lasted. Alexis watched as the young man sitting opposite her ate, despite his overwhelmingly free attitude. She had been traveling with him for a few months now, and she knew when he was nervous. Occasionally he would shift a glance over his shoulder, turn back, and then ruffle his jet-black hair with his hand, all the while smiling in that uniquely punch-able way. She wasn't exactly calm either. The fact that they had been recognized as humans unnerved Alexis. Jason made a compelling point. Humans were fast becoming notorious in the Milky Way for their prowess in war. Despite what Toyran the newsreel seemed to say, humanity wasn't that aggressive. Every conflict so far had been started by a neighboring race, admittedly afraid of the massive fleet sitting on their borders. But the fact remained that the imperial dominance of man had more than quintupled its territory in the 200 years it had been on the galactic stage. It was becoming a major player in galaxy-wide politics. Among the thousands of species that made up this modern galaxy, the Tauren were among the oldest. Alexis thought it was quite likely that the older male sitting at the table across from them outdated her own 20th century house back on Earth. The elder species were normally indecisive to the point of complacency, but something was different about this diner. A tension hanging in the air made her skin crawl. 2 or 3 groups of older Tauren had been slowly entering the diner and taking seats without ordering. She had assumed they had come to socialize, but she would still be happy to leave as soon as possible. Jason seemed to agree. When the waitress came back over, he already had his terminal ready in hand. She glanced at the terminal quickly, but then turned to speak to him. "Mr. Jason," she said, "we honored to have someone of status in diner. Please accept free finisher." The waitress curled her lips in what may have approximated a smile. Jason shot a look over to Alexis, who gently shook her head. He looked ready to decline when a gruff voice called from just behind him. "I'd accept that. It's very rude not to." The voice came from one of the elderly Tauren, his ears worn and leathery. His eyes, as hard to read as ever, were stony and resolute. Jason turned around to look at him. In the nervous moment, he tried to smile to ease the tension. The Tauren's ears flew backwards and he launched onto his feet. The waitress gasped and stepped back. Jonah paled but kept his eyes on the huge figure. The gruff Tauren strode towards the table, his huge arms flexing. He stopped right before the chair and looked down at Jason. "Was that a threat?" he demanded. Alexis prayed and prayed that Jason would meekly apologize, that his signature arrogance wouldn't get in the way. He stood up, squaring his meager 1.8 meters up the older figure. To any human, Jason would have been a giant, but to a Tauren, and one that Alexis figured must have been at least 300 years old, he was a child. It cleared him by a good meter or so. In any other situation, she might have thought Jason looked comical. Now, however, she was terrified. "Are you looking for a fight?" Jason asked. "How could I be? I am no human," the beast replied, glaring down at the man. Alexis noticed that this Tauren spoke far too elegantly for someone of his kind. Here was a citizen that had met many humans before. Jason Alexis called meekly. "We talked about the smiling." He ignored her. "How dare you? Do you have any idea who I am, you beast? He demanded. Alexis flinched. As it happens, I do, he replied, and then he swiped one of his huge arms across Jason's face. There was a sickening crunch as the force of the impact broke Jason's neck clear in half. His body went limp to the floor. Alexis screamed, not even noticing the other Taurans approaching from behind her. They grabbed her and she kicked and screamed, trying in vain to break free. Their size and weight made this effort impossible. She began to calm down. The gruff Tauran looked down at the body on the floor and made a strange grunt. Would you believe that creatures like this threaten the very security of our order? He asked, seemingly to the air. He chuckled to himself and then moved over to Alexis. She watched him approach with growing dread. She was going to die. She was going to die right now. It seems as if your trip has been cut short, my lady, he remarked. A shame for the council, I'm sure. Do you have any idea what you've just done? Alexis demanded. The Tauran chuckled again. Why must you ask me like I am some fool? Do you not recognize me, woman? Alexis frowned, and then she realized the voice was so familiar. Koryev J., you're the ambassador to Earth. Koryev looked slightly impressed. I am surprised. Someone of your stature recognizes a lowly inferior creature, such as myself. You know that the Emperor will demand blood for this, she asked. I am counting on it, he said, turning towards the Tauran who held Alexis. He grunted something at them in a language she did not understand, and they released her. Return to your empire and tell them of what I did. Let them know that we are ready. We will no longer be your prey. He pointed at the door. Alexis nodded and shot one more glance at the floor. Blood had started to eke out from the body that lay there. She sprinted from the diner, dodging around the waitress who glared at her as she did. The sound of engines flaring outside seemed to stir the contemplative Koryev into action. He flexed his arms. That will do it, he remarked, switching back to his native language. They will come, grunted one of the other elderly Tauran. We had best be ready. Don't worry, Gara. We will be, replied Koryev. They turned to leave. As they walked past the bar, he pulled out a much larger terminal and swept on it, transferring a lump sum to the owner behind the counter. For your patience, he grumbled. The bar owner nodded and called over the waitress. She nodded at Koryev as they passed each other and put an arm on her shoulder, gripping before moving on. Prince Jason Ellencher, first in line to the imperial dominance of man, lay forgotten on the floor in the back of the diner, the mixed look of terror and shock still stuck on his face. It took 3 weeks for a formal declaration of war, but the galaxy still burned like it never had before. Humanity would never be the same again. As it stands, I plan to call the completed story The War Game. The concept is thus. Humanity is a new but major player on the galactic stage. It is one of the carnivore races, a tiny minority among the galactic community of thousands of prey species. The imperial dominance of man has become notorious for its conquests of other species. This chapter serves as a prologue to the main story, depicting how the major conflict of the story begins. Our protagonist for much of the story is a commander, for hire. He takes advantage of humanity's unique skill at tactical warfare to make a comfortable living commanding fleets of alien ships. In the present Milky Way, any fleet that is not commanded by a human is one that won't be around much longer. Our protagonist will be one of the best. Shortly after the story begins, he is hired by Koryev to fight his own empire. Initially thinking it is a small defensive job, he soon discovers he is part of a much larger scheme to bring an end to the carnivore influence in galactic politics. That's all the background information I have at the moment. I hope you enjoyed my chapter. It was a lot of fun to make, and if it's a well-received idea, I would love you keep writing it. Be as brutal as you can with your feedback. I can take it.